So, folks, we're going to be bringing on Danny Bessner, as his friends know him. Wrote an excellent piece in the New Republic called "Does American Fascism Exist?" Danny, thank you so much for joining us today. Oh, we're not hearing you.
We're not getting your mic, Danny.
How about now?
There we go.
Beautiful.
All right. Sorry. Hey guys, thanks for having me.
We're happy to have you, man. And I should say, among other things, Danny's with Quincy. Danny is a professor of international studies and the host of the excellent, the must listen, the must subscribe on Substack podcast, American
I
Prestige.
couldn't agree more. The best podcast on earth, second only to Left Reckoning.
I mean, I've always told you, like, that's my workout pod. I'm getting swole.
Oh, geez, you must be putting up weight. Listening to my annoying, stupid voice.
No, I mean, I'm really happy to have you on as always, and we're going to talk about this piece on fascism, and people who have been listening to us over the years, have been listening to the Michael Brooks show. No, this is a subject that Danny's passionate about. I think we've done this. Like,
Jesus Christ, this is my passion. When I'm at the pearly gates, what did you do with life? Fucking wasted it on this stupid debate no one cares about.
That never goes away.
Yeah, the gift that keeps on not giving.
But we're going to do an episode for patrons this weekend with our friend Gene Bajlan on the Iraq War.
Excellent.
Because as people know, we're on the 20-year anniversary of the invasion. And I was thinking maybe to get us set up, right? Danny, could you remind people of just how horrifying that war and the pretense around it was? Because I know it's like almost cliche to say at this point, but one thing that has been wild to watch with the whole Trump era is how Trump has sort of overshadowed W. In people's minds is like the ultimate bad guy of history.
George W. Bush. Yeah, he's a good guy now. Yeah, I mean, the Iraq War, I'm not saying anything that people haven't heard before, but it was just a horribly destructive war, a consequence of both a particular moment in a larger history. And it was really, really damaging. Far more important to Iraq and the people in Iraq, and also, I would argue, to our own society. Militarizing our society, leading to permanent institutional changes like the erosion of civil liberties, initiating 2 decades of pointless wars. So it's one of the worst crimes in modern U.S. history, and it's absolutely terrible that anyone associated with it has been rehabilitated in either liberal imaginatories or left-wing ones.
How did it impact you, Danny? I'm curious. David, you were probably pretty young. Do you have a recollection of the run up to the Iraq War? Because personally, I had just gotten a TV in my room. I remember the shock and awe thing, like it was a new this fall on ABC. Shock and awe, watch a city get blown to smithereens, and I remember watching it, and the emotion wasn't immediate disgust. I wasn't immediately left, but I was kind of confused because you hear all this stuff and then you're watching on TV. Did it change your trajectory, Danny, or were you kind of already on a leftist trajectory?
Well, I think that I wasn't especially political either in high school. The war happened during my freshman year of college. I wasn't especially political. It didn't really interest me, and looking back on it, I think rightly. It wasn't, it was kind of the halcyon end of 1990s, early 2000s, end of history, and politics was presented as a type of technocratic affair mostly. My parents weren't especially political either. I mean, I guess at the time, Clinton-ish Democrats in New York. But I think the war, even though I didn't realize it when it first happened, did send me on a trajectory. It certainly got me more interested in foreign affairs. I think that's true for a lot of my generation. I mean, a foundational early adult experience of looking at what the American empire and its foreign policy did. And I actually wound up interning at the Council on Foreign Relations my senior year of college, probably because I had this interest sparked in me by Iraq. I was already interested in history, but I was mostly interested in the history of the Holocaust and Nazism. And this, I think, pushed me in a direction that eventually took me to the history of U.S. foreign relations.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going to protest at the state capitol here in Texas because I feel like a lot of people in Austin in particular felt, I don't know, an ownership of the problem in the sense that it had been sort of exported nationwide. I'm talking about Bush. But no, I mean, like, if anything, because I was so young when it was sort of, I remember like the newscast being like feeling very weird about the way it was being sort of portrayed, like this kind of like grainy footage of tanks rolling through was like the opening montage for the local news when the war started. Like every day, it was just like, I can't remember what it was called, like War Update or something like that, but using like footage of like actual violence. Sort of just introduce a segment. I wouldn't say I had a very developed disgust at it, but I remember feeling like very uncomfortable. But like, I mean, I think for a lot of people, like in all of our generations, like it really, um, I hope, like set up a healthy distrust of like the state and what you're being told, because the thing that is so wild to look back at the Iraq War is like all the pretenses, even at the time, you could sort of tell that they were bogus, but eventually, like, you know, when you get more information, you realize like, no, they were really just like flying by the seat of their pants on this thing.
Yeah, I think that's broadly speaking. A lot of bad theory and a lot of bad decision making went into it. That was proven bad pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it didn't take very long for it to descend into disaster. So, you know, one of the many fiascos of U.S. foreign policy, and this was ours.
Well, we're gonna have Gene on and just letting folks know we got some Hitchens. We've been playing Hitchens a little bit on this program. I know Ben's obviously into them, but Matt and I were saying it's like we might have been a little too soft on him, or at least like we just don't want to bog it down with the Iraq War discussion. We're gonna do it there. We have a pretty damning clip of Hitchens' support for that war, which is absolutely wild when you look at it in the context. Like there's the Hitchens War, what he was talking about and what was actually happening. Oftentimes like they didn't really line up too well, and but I want to bring this up, one, because it's the you know, the anniversary, but two, to maybe set us up on this fascism conversation, because um the reason I bring up Bush and the Iraq War in the context of the fascism conversation is that, like, you know, the American state does really bad things regularly. And there's something about like Trump that I think really captures like the frustration, the imagination. Like, you should be outraged at the things that Trump was getting into and doing. Um, but sometimes it was sort of like, instead of getting mad at the things that were actually happening, it was like this kind of specter of like fascism is coming to America, like via Trump. And then, I mean, maybe to start us off talking about this, you know, could you maybe give people an understanding of like why you think this question is like worth, like, why is it worthwhile to say to somebody who's like going and calling all of their political opponents fascists, that like that might not really line up with the historical record, or might not be the best framing to understand what's happening?
Sure. So the way that I would describe it is the debate has two broad elements that run in parallel and oftentimes intersect, and that's an analytical one and there's a political one. So there's the analytical question of, is the United States since 2016 or in 2023 meaningfully analogical? Could you draw useful analogies between the modern US, the contemporary US, and Nazi Germany, which is what most people are referring to when they use the word fascist? And then there's the political question, whether identifying fascist is a useful way to mobilize people against the extreme right wing. And I think the answer to both of those questions is no. I don't think that the 2023 United States meaningfully reflects the actually existing conditions of Germany in the 1920s or 1930s. And I don't think the term has been especially politically useful to the left.
I mean, I want to tease this out a little bit more, but maybe like from my perspective, like an example, and I don't want to come at this person, but there was a very famous like kind of TikTok social media video when it was Trump versus Biden, where this person is basically saying like, "Oh, don't criticize Biden on like on his role under Obama when it came to Obama's border policy. There's a fascist in the White House. There are kids in cages, right?"
Mm.
And you know, like I can certainly understand saying like I understand the arguments like get Trump out of there, all of that kind of stuff. But it creates this kind of sloppy thinking where it's like the border activities that Trump was getting into when he was president being somehow like separate or different from like the needs or the desires of like the American state when it comes to the border. As people know, Joe Biden has effectively made Trump's policy on asylum permanent. And I should add, attached an app to it, which is the most insane
Yeah, the app
thing.
breaks too. It's
The app breaks and it
geez,
can't
come on.
tell. People who have
Silicon
darker
Valley.
skin tones from
You
mine.
guys sound like a couple of guys who've never launched an app before. Okay, you know.
But the point I'm getting at here is that like it's right to say what Trump was doing at the border was wrong, and it's right to say what Biden was doing at the border is wrong. But if you place the energy, if you place like where that was coming from on Trump's position when he was president, to like Trump is, you know, like a fascist and is like sort of motivated by like trying to create fascism in this country, instead of recognizing it as like a function of like the American state, like, you know, functionally, like one of the big differences between Trump and Biden when it comes to the border has been that like Trump celebrated it, right, which is bad and disgusting. Biden's quiet about it, right? And I think that like it creates sloppy thinking when you're sitting here saying that like all energies need to be sort of motivated to like defeating this very obscure like fascist threat, instead of like the very real material reasons for why things are the way they are.
Yeah, and that's the affective element. Like as I put in the piece, I forget the exact phrasing, but genocidal militarism, racism, xenophobia, obsession with incarcerating minorities were not fascist inventions. They long predate it. And so I think that the term oftentimes has a bit of a foreign valence because there never was true blue fascism here. It was a European phenomenon. And I think it actually, again, in terms of analysis, obscures more powerful indigenous traditions that exist on the extreme right, rather than illuminates them. And then some people would say, well, it's a way to identify X or Y and be politically useful. I just don't think that's borne out, really. So yeah, the interesting thing from a meta debate, meta discursive perspective is how many people take it personally, and what that says about the operation of identity in American politics, and how people identify with particular positions, like truly identify with them, as another form of self-styled branding. So I think that the fascism debate, in terms from a meta level, is also interesting to look at it from that perspective. I think I had like 3 people today. Friend of the pod, Noah Berlatsky, responded, and John Chait responded in New York Magazine, right? And so what made them respond? They feel attacked at a core element of their being, of their sort of brand identity.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I've never understood about this like debate, I guess, as I've watched you and like other people engage in it, is like, and like I'll just cite Orwell just to on this. Like, there's the quote from the Politics in the English Language that people are familiar with, which is the word fascism has now no meaning except that insofar as it signifies something not desirable. And I think that's kind of similar to what you and the book you review say. There's this other quote here that I also like agree with, and this is sort of like I guess a counterpoint to yours. And I'd preface this by saying I agree with you entirely on like the use of the word fascism to describe a Trump America. I think it's like the only way I'm interested in is in kind of this broad sense here, which Orwell gets to, which is this. From on an essay, I believe, about the Spanish Civil War. When one thinks of all the people who support or have supported fascism, one stands amazed at their diversity. What a crew. Think of the program, which at any rate for a while could bring Hitler, Petain, Montagu, Norman, Pavlovich, William Randolph Hearst, Stryker, Bookman, Pound, Coteau. I'm not going to read everyone, but Father Coughlin, you get it. All in the same boat. But the clue is really very simple. They're all people with something to lose, or people who long for he continues, their hierarchical society. Now, is that
Yeah, he's just using the classic loose definition of fascism, basically. He's like, these people are on the right, and fascism is a loaded term in the 1940s, and we know it means really bad, and so I'm grouping all of these people together. He's using it in the common sense way, basically,
And do you
in that
think
term.
is because like for me, it's like I find less objectionable the people who were basically saying through the Bush administration, like this is a fascist thing. Like I have no problem with like say the historiographic or analytical correction there, but I would also like learn from people who would use that term
For sure. It
basically,
became like
right?
a thing on the left, right? I mean, like going back to the mid 1960s, fascist pigs, this was a common
Mhm.
thing on the left. It's a political language, which is
Yeah.
fine, right? And not political language doesn't need to be analytically useful or analytically correct. And oftentimes these things do get effectively what has happened in the modern debate is that people have been wanting to make a political they use an analytical justification for what is fundamentally a political term. And I think that there's a lot of confusion due to that. They do what I refer to as the checklist of fascism. If these 15 things are checked off, then it's fascism, and if it's not, then it's not. And I would just say again, analytically, I don't think it's correct for a variety of reasons to meaningfully compare what's happening today. But if you just want to use the term in a political sense to identify as like, we really don't like that thing, and we're really stand against that thing, that's fine. It's basic, then it's a curse word. Then it's exactly what I said. Then it's a curse word, and just say this is a curse word, and we don't have there's not a strong analytical core to this term. Now, if you want to say it's a curse word, that's fine. But I think people make claims that it's politically useful for organizing. I just don't think that's borne out. Or at least I'm skeptical of it. You don't have to make an analytical justification for a political term. It's just that might be related to sort of the argumentative structures of the internet, where people have to produce content over and over and over again. So they kind of have to make a mountain out of a molehill, as it were.
I mean, I want to bring it back to like the contemporary stuff in a second, because it is funny that it's like some of the reaction to your piece, Danny, was as if like you were at like this rally where everybody was about to do this really big thing, and you were just screaming that like, "No, you're using the wrong terminology." It's like, no, you're saying that like they're either using this as just like a curse word or like pejorative, or if you are saying that this has like real analytical structure to it, very hollow. But like,
so are my arguments, right? Like, feel free to disagree. It's kind of pathetic how people identify with these things. It just shows again how politics is kayfabe and cosplay. That we are so disconnected from actually feeling, and I think correctly, that we can affect things. This is what people get. They have a particular affective attachment to a term, which should be a term that, like any term, is under debate, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And am I wrong? And maybe you're not the person to ask about this, Danny, but it feels like they take more exception to you making points like this than, say, like Adam Tooze, or was it like that historian Richard Evans or something?
Yeah, it's anti-Semitism. No, I mean, people, I'm just kidding about that. People want, Tooze is a very powerful person in the profession. I mean, I like Tooze. He's been on my podcast. He's a really smart guy.
Tuesday, great episode.
Yeah. We're gonna have him back. Maybe not after he hears this, but no, he's a powerful guy. And there's like a string of sort of like lefty grad student types who want to associate with them with Adam, because they, for various affective and professional reasons. A lot of these people are like broadly in the New York media scene, broadly in the New York intellectual scene, which is a scene I've never, even though I'm actually from New York, the outer boroughs, but it's one that I've never been a part of, because I left New York after college to go to Duke, and then I taught at Washington. So I think that I've never been a part of the scene, so I don't abide by the various norms of it. So I think there's a lot of
bad boy.
Yeah, I just don't care.
That's what a bad boy would say.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I think about it is I've done the reading and they've read a lot of posts. There's a big difference. I didn't start writing in public until after I had submitted my book manuscript. And this is actually interesting because it gets into the questions of democratization of culture, which has positives and negatives, like everything. It's good that everyone has a voice to some degree, and it's also, there are people who spend more time on things, oftentimes have different opinions for various reasons.
I know this is like a loaded question, and like I'm not expecting you to like break it down all the way, but like some of the defining, like, be they historical or ideological aspects of like fascism that you think are sort of not maybe apparent in like the Trump movement compared to like Mussolini, and then to like and then to like Hitler and the Nazis, right? Because like you hear a lot of different versions of, like, as you said, like there's the echo kind of checklist that people like to use. The other kind of popular one is it's just like corporate power mixed with the state. Is like, that's what fascism is, right? I mean, like, can we put some historical meat on the term?
If you're looking at the structures of that are the enabling conditions of fascism, I would say there are three things. One is the experience of total war, both in the trenches and on the home front. In the trenches, it creates a generation of incredibly scarred people who are very alienated from society, who have true trauma, who do things like form violent street gangs and fight each other and kill each other. There's also the experience of total war at home, which makes people skeptical of politics writ large and nostalgic for a conservative reactionary position. So both of those, I think, are foundational to the development of both Italian and European fascism. There's an interesting book. I forget the author. It's in German, but he talks about how like all of the Italian fascist leaders were veterans, or like not all, but most or a lot, plurality perhaps, were veterans of a particular front in the Austro-Italian World War I area, right? So these things are like foundational. Nothing is equivalent to that in the modern United States, and it's offensive and absurd when people claim otherwise. Second, in terms of the capital, why did capital align with fascist regimes? It was because there is an existence of a powerful left. Luckily for people who are afraid of fascism, the left has been tamed in this country for almost 100 years now, and capital would prefer to align with liberalism. I think, if you look at it historically, capital prefers that than it does fascism. So that structuring condition also doesn't exist. And then I would argue one that I don't hear many people talk about, but if you look at just the state of the state, literally like the state apparatus in the 20s and the 30s, it's very different from that which exists today. States were capable of being taken over by small, dedicated groups. That is no longer true today. I would think the bureaucratization of the US state over the last 70 plus years, plus the various structural features of it that basically make popular politics virtually impossible today, also mitigate against using the fascist analogy. And I've written about this in a piece called, I think it's called The End of Mass Politics. That we often have this language of mass politics and even a political understanding that assumes the masses are politically meaningful. And I'm not sure that's really the case any longer. Fascism is very much a movement that is a function of the masses. This was one of the first things that people identified in the 30s and the 40s. So those three structuring conditions, just to repeat, the experience of total war, the existence of a powerful left, and a state that is capable of being taken over, no longer exist. And then there's just a larger thing. I think there's much more important indigenous traditions in this country to draw on to explain the American far right that I think, using the term fascism occludes.
Speaking to the one point about the
By the way, just in the chat, someone said that would seem to define it so narrowly, then almost nothing could be called fascism today. Precisely. If you want to make analogical reasoning, you have to have like clear analogical stakes. You can't just use, or feel free to use it as a curse word, but that's not analytically powerful. Sorry, Matt.
The one about no challenge from the left. Could just a sort of collapse in political legitimacy, absence of that, necessitate like a sort of like turn to more fascisty
I don't
measures?
think they need to. I think Americans are just going to since the 60s, our entire political identity has been organized around consumption, i.e. buying shit. And I don't think that's going to change with the collapse of political legitimacy. In fact, I think political legitimacy in this country rests on that.
Would you make a distinction between like policy and politics? And what I mean by that is that like people will oftentimes be like, well, this is a fascist policy, right? So you see like DeSantis doing his stuff in Florida right now, trying to make journalists like sign up with the state, right? Very worrying and authoritarian, certainly. But like you also look at like times like in the United States in the Civil War, right? Like Lincoln came after certain journalists and things like that, right? Like, would you say Lincoln, is a fascist?
That's liberalism, right? I mean, I think like it's interesting you bring that up, David, because I have a piece on the history of like basically emergency powers and liberalism. So I think there are certain features that people identify as fascist that are actually common to all of the great ideologies that emerged out of the industrialization of the 19th century, right? If you think, I hate when academics do that, right, wrong. So I think that if you think liberalism, I think of liberalism and communism and socialism and a little bit later. And it's not a surprise that fascism emerges from Germany and Italy, which were two of the states to unite much later than Britain and France. I think that you see that these are all basically ideological approaches to dealing with this explosion that was engendered by industrialization. So you have someone like Hitler who abrogates normal politics in the 1930s. But David, what you're referring to correctly is you also have someone like Lincoln, who abrogates normal politics in the 1860s. You also have someone like Woodrow Wilson, who abrogates normal politics in 1917 and 18. You also, of course, have FDR, who abrogates normal politics in the 1930s. I think FDR passes 3,721 executive orders, which is like orders of magnitude more than any other president. And I would say executive order is like one of the least democratic things you could do. So these
I
are
would just jump in here to say, like, this is where my reading of Gore Vidal got confusing, because I think he basically calls FDR fascist on this sort of like grounds.
And a lot of people called FDR fascist in the 1930s at the time. I would say it's a feature of liberalism, and it's a feature of communism, and it's a feature of fascism, because dealing with the forces of industrialization requires that sort of executive authority, as opposed. So people would identify this sort of emergency politics as fascist when it's endemic to liberalism. It's endemic to communism. It's endemic to all the great ideologies of modernity. And you saw it, of course, in our own lifetimes during the War on Terror, talking about Iraq, right? This was like the great resurgence of Cold War liberalism because it was an quote unquote emergency moment.
No, I mean, I totally agree. And like, maybe like it's another example of this is different from like the fascism debate, but like, it's like sometimes you see people on our side, saying like, like infrastructure projects are like socialist, or like the post office is socialist. And like, don't get me wrong, I can see how that can be rhetorically powerful. I mean, I always say to people, when I was 17 at Occupy, I saw a sign that said, "Do you like firefighters?" And the post office, you're a socialist. And it moved me a little bit. But you look analytically, it's just like, well, any state that does anything being socialist is probably not the best way to understand socialism as a political movement and political force, right? And and I like that your like argument, your point here is like, these things are just like illiberalism. But I wanted to like keep for just one second on like the mass here too, because I think that that's something that's missing and is sometimes misinterpreted or misimagined, because like Trumpism is a very distinct and unique American political force, I would say, right, in the sense of its ability to mobilize certain people. But I think
it's the way that I would put
down it is. Yeah,
just very quickly, it's mobilizing a new political coalition. And this happens periodically. And Tim Shank's new book talks about how it happened. So that's I think how I would frame it. Like every few generations, there's a new political coalition that emerges. Trump's might be permanent, might be not. Obama also had a particular coalition that didn't prove permanent, right? It's to be decided how permanent this quote unquote realignment is or isn't. Sorry, David, please.
Oh no! I mean, I think that's a decent point, and I think that understanding that coalition level stuff is really critical for Trumpism, because like the thing with Trump that is like interesting is like it's very top down and it's very media based and it's not organized. Do you get what I mean? It's like there aren't like Trump clubs, right?
Right, because Americans don't have any type of clubs.
Which is
we're
very
all bowling
different,
alone.
Which is very different from like existing fascist
In the
movements.
1920s, the 1920s, I think there were 4 voluntary associations for every 1,000 Americans. Wow. I was just reading about this. So that, like, think about that. That's like a society with interstitial sort of mediating institutions that could channel things like anger. Right now, we're all just yelling. People are just yelling at me online. Right? That's politically quiescence. It's not politics. It's identity and neoliberal identity branding. Is how I would frame that. It's fake politics, but people really feel like they're doing politics. It's, again, sad and pathetic. Like much of our age.
No, and I mean, we've been sort of talking about it a bit, but like, let me see if I can grab it. But like, one of the bits that I think was really astute in your piece is like that there, like, the way that you get attacked for this piece, or for making these kind of arguments, like there is like a very important sense of like identity making in utilizing the term fascist, right? So to define
this is a good one. This got a lot of people mad. You read it, David.
let me pull it really quick.
My editor, Laura, I hope I'm not she's like, damn, this was zing. I think she wrote when she read it.
All right, I'll pull this up so everyone can see. Because I think that this really gets at not just like why people are mad about your piece, but it's like, I mean, hell, Dan, I would like to get you on the podcast just to talk about how mad people get at you online, because it's fun.
Again, David, it's anti-Semitism. You hate to see it.
I have seen some things that do sort of get like you're betraying your people or something like that, which is like, come on, man. But this, I don't know, I'll read this bit. The contemporary fascism debate is thus about much more than fascism. It's about people's sense of self in a moment of anti-popular politics. And it's for this reason that the debate, which on its surface is as academic as a discussion could possibly be, has engendered so much rancor. When you attack someone's identification of fascism, you're attacking more than a political diagnosis. You're attacking their very identity.
Precisely.
Where's this coming from? I mean, help us understand.
So the question is, why did people get so upset about it? And there's clearly an affective dimension to it. There's some sort of identification with it. And I think that in a moment when people don't feel that they could actually affect policy in the post-Bernie moments, Biden's president, we have a bunch of octogenarians running for president. It feels like millennials in particular can't buy houses. They're laden with student debt. People have constructed a type of existential struggle between an enemy that gives their lives political meaning. Some people follow sports, some people follow, I don't know, politics, right? And so it's part of the right team. And identifying fascist, I think, allows one to imagine oneself as part of, like, really the last great struggle, particularly that the United States was on the right side of. And so a lot of people in this country, whether they know it or not, are American exceptionalists. And so I think that identifying fascism allows one to imagine oneself as part of a world historical struggle that is absolutely of consequential political meaning, because the original struggle against fascism was absolutely of consequential political meaning. And so I think there's a lot of that going on here.
Yeah, and so, sorry, Matt.
Well, you go ahead. I got a question that's maybe.
Well, I'm saying, like,
a
you
bit
can
better
really
for the end.
construct a lot of different identities out of this too, right? You can construct, an identity as like an anti-fascist in the sense of like Antifa participating in black bloc stuff. You can also construct an identity of just sort of like a liberal consumer. So, like, I'm fighting against like this fascist attack on this country, so I'm going to watch MSNBC. I'm going to make sure I vote for Biden and tell my aunts and uncles to do it, right?
There are different flavors of it. There's a liberal flavor. There's a center. I think when we're talking about the broad left, it's mostly what I would call the Warren voter demographic that seems most identified with it. I would have to do some more thinking about the relationship between that political constituency and but so basically left liberals more than flat out socialists seem to be more attached to the label. And I haven't done enough real thinking about what would be the comparisons there, but that seems to be who gets maddest at me, at least.
Is that like anxiety about, like, oh, we put our chips on Popular Front as like the animating force behind our politics?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think I do think that the way that fascist has the most powerful instantiation, or sorry, use of fascism in the United States has been by liberals who have used it to basically close off left-wing politics. That's just, they used it to construct the national security state. Whenever there seems to be a left challenge, there's horseshoe theory. We saw that happen over the last 7 years. We just lived through it. So maybe it has something to do with that, because I am skeptical of a Popular Front strategy working in this country, because I think liberals are just way more hegemonic and way more powerful. So any left liberal alliance will inevitably lead to the left being a junior, barely extant partner, because we don't live in a parliamentary system. So the left can actually function as a parliamentary power.
Nowhere that's evident. And
yeah. So I mean, like, but I mean, be that as it may, if and I also don't think like we're on the verge of a fascist takeover, right? If I thought we were genuinely on the verge of a fascist takeover, then I would have a different political opinion. I don't think that. I think that the major threats we face are just plain old liberal politics, capitalism, imperialism, and the American state. Those are still the main obstacles. It's not a boogeyman far right, even though there has been a rise in far right violence. I don't think they pose a structural threat. So, it's just that's my analysis of the situation.
And I mean,
by the way, someone who says that I'm making fun of a Black Panther speech in the chat, I think they're confusing me with someone else on Twitter, because I have never talked about the Black Panthers in my life in either public or really, I don't know enough about it to really even talk about it. So again, they're confusing me. Anti-Semitism rears its ugly head.
You never know what's going to happen in the chat. But no, I mean, I think that like one thing too that's like really important to hit on, and I almost feel bad, like embarrassed to have to say it, but like you're not saying these things aren't bad, right? And I think there's like this
And I
other aspect too,
stated
where it's
that in the
just like,
piece. I mean,
I know.
what do
You're
people
trying to
want?
But like, there's
America
so much
off.
emotion. There's if you say, "Oh, this isn't fascism," that means you're saying, oh, "I think it's not dangerous. I think it's not bad. I think it's not like a threat in any kind of way." No, it's trying to understand, what the motivations and the forces that we're up against are. And again, like, I mean, I'll just say it. I think that some of this, as I said earlier, has created some sloppy thinking on, like, I will say, like, on the socialist left, certainly the center left thing, but that's like a whole world of problems, where like if you're not able to identify your enemies, if you're not able to identify the forces and the motivation for their activities and what their goals are, you start getting into like sloppy thinking. And if you do think that we're 6 months away from goose stepping, people goose stepping into the Capitol and overthrowing American democracy, right? You're going to participate in politics with a kind of very, very worried energy, and you're not going to be able to plan and do the kind of work that, like, if you want to build a socialist movement in this country, that's going to take a long ass time. People are demobilized, people are demoralized, the institutions aren't there. That's going to take years of serious organizing, years of serious work. And if you're sitting here thinking, well, we don't have time, we have 6 months to basically try to figure something out, right? You're not going to be able to build the kind of movement that's capable of doing the things that
Yeah,
we
and
want
it's all
to do.
just fantasy. It's people are in their heads, and social media encourages people to be in their heads all day looking at this screen and then constructing this fantasy, which I think is very disconnected from reality. Very disconnected.
Well, so two kind of quicker questions I have is, what do we call Bolsonaro then?
Friend of the pod.
Okay.
He's a right wing authoritarian. I mean, I think if you might be able to draw some connections between Bolsonaro and actually existing fascist groups on the ground. I don't know enough about that, but I think he's standard Latin American right wing authoritarian, of which there is a
Yeah.
long, proud history in Latin America that predated fascism by quite a while.
And David and I, before we're having this conversation, like we'd both probably, at least I would probably, in the slur slash using it as a curse word, like use Confederate. Is that an improvement, or is it still like, are we still like looking backward for like some sort of transcendental term that's going to capture him for
Well, I
us?
mean, the truth is, I don't think the identification of it using any word is especially politically meaningful. I
Yeah.
think this is really a debate for the eggheads. I think the politically meaningful work of politics involves material distribution ultimately. But so that, I mean, if people want to use fascists, that's fine. I am not the fascist approver or not approver. I made a particular argument about its analytical and political utility, and people could choose to ignore that or not. And that's what's great about this beautiful country. But I ultimately think that politics is not decided over terminological debates.
Well, I mean, before we move on, Strom had a question for you, Danny. Says, is the isolated, miserable incel man analogous to the antisocial, lumpenized, demob soldier of the late 1910s, 1920s?
Strom, Mr. McCallum, I would encourage you to read World War I memoirs and tell me if the experience of being in the trenches for several years is meaningfully analogous to existing on the internet.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's more than fair. I mean, yeah. There was another kind of historical argument that I saw that you were getting into on Twitter, and it's something that I've seen.
Is this the Nazi American thing?
About the Nazi American thing, and like, I'd like to break this down because, like, I think that this again, like, because there's like few questions that we're getting at here. It's like, what is the right, what is the correct, analysis of this or that. But then there is this kind of like understanding of history, and there's sometimes like things come out of like a book or a study, and it gets like a couple articles, and then people sort of like reorient their whole world.
It's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
what I have seen since studying this, that in popular discourse on podcasts and even in some popular articles, that people claim that the United States was a major cause of Hitler's policy is very wild to me. I think they're referring to James Q. Whitman's book as a titled Hitler's American Model.
Yeah.
The title is stronger than the claims actually made in the book, if I recall. He's mostly doing, and my friend Michael Johanna, who's a legal scholar, I think has helped me see this, mostly doing comparative legal analysis of these regime types. And as someone who actually has a PhD in European history, I just think there are a lot more primary causes to Nazism. That the European Catholic Church, centuries of anti-Semitism, the material relations of Jews to larger European societies, the advent of nationalism in the 19th century, particular far-right ideas that emerge in regard to the racialization of Jews. And that's just 6 that I barely even thought about that are more important than the United States in shaping Hitler's Germany. I think people embrace it because it's this form of what I like to call negative American exceptionalism. Because instead of saying like America is exceptionally good, what this does, it describes America to a primary causal force in all historical events. And so I think that is like America KKK type stuff. And believe me, this country has done an enormous amount of damage in the world. And an enormous amount of horror has been caused by this country, both here and abroad. But I don't think, as a historical explanation of Nazi Germany, the United States was a primary cause. And I think that's empirically borne out, and that's not even quite what Whitman was saying. So it's kind of funny to see people like totally embrace this idea, and then in sort of like tweet Whitman at me, or one of the articles or two that were based on his book. And I think I would just encourage people to think about causal hierarchies, and that is an important form of identifying, both in terms of historical analysis and today, what is most important.
I mean, like, look, it's interesting to look at the history, for example, of like Nazis sort of taking inspiration from racial codes in the United States, right? That's like a very worthwhile, like,
Absolutely,
historical
and it's true.
endeavor,
Yeah,
and
it's
it's
true.
true. But like,
that really did happen.
but like this move, and I think the negative American exceptionalism is a great way to sort of frame it. I mean, you see this on the left too, where it's like Bolsonaro can solely or like exclusively or mainly be explained by like American meddling. In Brazil, it's like, don't get us wrong, we covered this with Michael. The U.S. role in Lava Jato is serious, and it made a difference there. But also, like, you have to have the right wing authoritarian freaks in Brazil on the ground, and those develop out of a particular context in Brazil, right? And this like fixation is like, we're going to pin all of these forces on America. It's not saying, oh, America's so great and like they're innocent.
Americans want to feel special, even if it's a bad kind of special.
Yeah, I mean that is like, right, like the Lebensraum thing, like, right, like that's what people say, like Hitler. It's been a while. I haven't read that book, but we had him on Majority Report, and it was like, I think there's like, yeah, Hitler gestured towards America, and like, wouldn't it be nice to have a whole bunch of land you could just like conquer or whatever like that? But that sticks out to us because we're America, right? Like,
it's not a major cause. I mean, it's again, it did happen and it is real. But if you're trying, one of the things that historians do is try to, identify causal hierarchies of what's more or less important. And we've just, in my opinion, at least, some people in the popular discursive realm have exaggerated this to a significant degree. I think if we're thinking about America, I think more causally important than this in particular. But there's also like centuries of church law to draw on. It's like that were like horribly anti-Semitic, going back to Augustine and Aquinas and like Paul and like theological. It's just so absurd. But anyway, the thing that America is important for is I do think Hitler viewed himself as in a existential struggle with Anglo-American imperialism. And I think that was a primary structuring force of his policies. I would say, if we want to talk about America, that's where it has sort of as this image for Hitler to imagine Germany as having to go against, and thus create an economic realm that would be able over the long term to compete with the Anglo-American realm.
Have you interacted with the Kanye critique of your piece, Danny? Have you come across this yet?
What was the Kanye critique? That Nazis are good?
Well, you talk about how in the piece, and I generally agree. It's like, you have people like Matt Walsh who says that they're a quote theocratic fascists, but I think you're sort of saying this like it's triggering the libs more than like representative of like
is Matt Walsh a profound political thinker? It's just this media shit that we all engage in.
And then you say there are no fascist celebrities, and then people responded by saying, "Well, there's Kanye."
Oh,
Um,
right. Well, there you go. My problem is
and
my
it's like,
argument
I
is
don't know.
disproved.
I mean, this is somebody who's very clearly having, serious
It's not
issues
even
in a
it's not even
public forum.
it's not even a serious thing to say. I mean,
Yeah.
like, the most fun one was that people pointed to like um, Americans who had white supremacist connections.
Hmm.
Yes, white supremacy is a thing in the United States.
Homegrown too, by the
Absolutely.
way. It's not some
Homegrown.
German or
Yeah, it's not a
Italian
German
like
event. Totally
importation.
agree. So it's also funny. A lot of the responses were like, "This is bad. You're saying this isn't fascism," and it just totally misses the point of the piece, and it makes you worry for humanity's future.
Well, I mean, but it's the same. I mean, I think that there's something to be like talked about too, is that like, there is like the need for something to be foreign, for it to be like a threat, right? So it's like the fascism is one thing, but you see this in the US, right? Whenever the GOP here does something horrible, it's like, well, this is just like the Taliban,
Yeah, or
right?
the use of the word warlord or something along those lines, right? It's sort of an othering thing.
And it's like it's just amazing with all of the work on at least popular work lately about sort of like revisiting American history to sort of recognize that like the story you were told in elementary school, middle school of like this shining democratic republic has a lot of skeletons in his closet, is sort of culminating in this, I don't know, this analysis of contemporary American politics as if these things are sort of threats from the outside, Russia, right?
Mm.
Fascism, um, whatever, right? Instead of it being something that's homegrown, which, like, again, if you are like reading 1619 Project, which of course we have very serious like criticisms of all, a lot of these kind of more liberal understandings of American history, but like that's been like the dominant cult like way to look at American history is like through that more critical lens. And then contemporary is like, well, these foreign forces are basically screwing over, like invading and changing America fundamentally.
Yeah, and that gets into the one of the first points I made in the piece, which is that it includes the indigenous sources of a lot of this a lot of these
Hmm.
hateful processes and phenomena. It's just it's profoundly American. You don't need fascist to describe it.
Yeah, it's not that you're being easy on America by not using fascism. It's that
I'm being harder.
they're being easy on
I'm the
liberalism.
most critical of America, actually, Matt.
There you go. Well, that's
Well,
all. That's all we're here for.
do you think, I mean, just in the last couple of minutes, I mean, like another term that was sort of thrown around was populism. And I know we had you on to talk about like the anti-politics or like the end of mass politics, I believe is the title,
Mhm.
a little while ago. And populism is another one of those terms that's like extremely squishy. Like Bernie's a populist and Trump's a populist. They just have different ideologies attached to their.
It's interesting because it's also connected to liberalism. Because so what I would argue is that in the 40s and the 50s, and I talk about this in the piece, even though we in America constantly used the left-right political spectrum to understand politics, before World War II, this wasn't very common. Americans, those who thought about these things, like the literate intellectuals, would argue that America had political movements and formations that stood apart from Europe, which basically for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries had communists on the left and monarchists on the right. In the 30s and 40s in Europe, obviously the fascists came to displace monarchists on the right because after World War
Mhm.
One, the European aristocracy is destroyed. What liberals in the United States did was they started using this political spectrum in the 1940s and 1950s, but instead of putting monarchy on the right, they put fascist on the right. They
Mm.
also put populist somewhere there as well. Now, populist was also associated with the term totalitarianism, which was kind of part of these debates, which was separate. Totalitarianism was sort of left-wing extremism and right-wing extremism in one, and populism was related to totalitarianism. So it's messy when you look at the actual history. But in the 40s and the 50s, both populism and fascism, in different ways, served as means to justify liberalism as "quote unquote" moderate, as in the center of extremes. And that's why someone like Richard Hofstadter, a very significant Cold War liberal, made his political career writing about populism. That's why someone like Hannah Arendt, another Cold War liberal,
Mhm.
made her career writing about totalitarianism. And a lot of those people earlier, like someone like I'm trying to think of like Franz Borkenau, also made who later becomes like the first criminologist, another Cold War liberal, also talks about fascism and communism as being very similar. So populism and fascism historically have served very similar functions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that The populism is just one that in like contemporary discourse. I mean, it's funny. It's sort of like seems to have fallen out of favors. Like 2017, 2018. I felt like there were a lot of
You
think
remember?
pieces.
Do you remember all those times where it's like, oh yeah, Bernie's a good populist, but Jeremy Corbyn's a bad populist? You'd have people try to argue that, like, it's just like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, it's so silly.
And then, of course, I associate it with like the worst tradition on the left. I mean, not the worst. That's not fair. The most ineffective and a real waste of time, like Chantal Mouffe and Leclau, like the kind of retreat into, I don't know, obscurity and the retreat from class struggle and socialism and Marxism. But I mean, yeah, it's just I think that the response to your piece really shows that there is a very serious self-identification with utilizing being an anti-fascist. I think that the point that in addition to like the historical point about whether or not that's a good terminology or not, I think it really hits at something you've written about a lot, you've talked about a lot, which is just like sense that like people I think have a lot of like political energy, right? They're like frustrated at things, they want to do
My
something
friend
different.
Megan Day put it great. She's so
Yeah.
smart. She's like, people are more polarized since 2016 than they have been in our lifetimes. So you have incredible polarization coexisting with an anti-democratic political structure. And that leads people to get mad about this.
Yeah. And I think unfortunately there's just a lot of avenues for people to outlet that energy in ways that aren't very material.
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know.
you got also like you got to get that dopamine hit to get through the day. So I get it. Like we live incredibly alienated lives. It's depressing. It sucks. So I don't begrudge people if they're getting that little dopamine hits, but just maybe think a little deeper.
Yeah. Well, one, folks, if you're looking for a dopamine hit, American Prestige Pod will deliver. Danny, really appreciate having you on the show. Really appreciate reading all of your work. And definitely would be happy to do this again sometime. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about the deep state or the state, because I think that that's an avenue that on the left is sort of underdeveloped, at least in the popular discourse, for thinking about building power. But Danny, really appreciate you coming on, and thank you for fighting back against people online. It's been very fun to watch, if nothing else.
Yeah, thanks guys. Thanks for having me. I hope to come back soon.
Hell yeah, brother. Well, take care.
Thanks, Danny.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I do highly suggest if you haven't read the piece, folks, I'll put it up on screen for everybody. Again, it's in the New Republic. I've read it so much in preparation for the show. I have exhausted my free articles on the New Republic on a few different platforms. But does American fascism exist? For nearly a century, Americans have been throwing the term around without agreeing what that means. It's really excellent piece. Danny is wonderful, and if you haven't been listening to the American Prestige podcast, it's definitely, probably like one of my favorites.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I mean, it's indispensable. There's a lot of podcasts that have been formed since like we were on TMBS, for instance, and
Mhm.
that one is like one that even when I was on vacation, like I'm listening to that.
Just before we go, just because I'm sorry, Strom, we missed it because we were live, but Strom was saying on their question about the incel and World War One, just speculating as to whether they have the same potential to find meaning in reactionary group violence. I just don't think that represents the incel community, for example, represents enough of like the American population to like even make the comparison. And I don't think that the comparison holds. I don't think that social isolation and loneliness, and yeah, I mean, we've seen violence come out of that community. I don't think that there's not bad things and that are happening there, or potential for people to utilize that frustration for wicked ends. But I don't think that it's comparable to like World War One veterans coming back to an extremely atomized and devastated society like you saw in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, this is the the thing with metaphor is how much do you subscribe to it based on like the the essence you want to draw from it, like, or versus like a surface level sort of historical rhyming of like, okay, if that surplus population of males conditioned to violence, like that is somewhat similar, but it's not like It's not like so similar where you can
But he says here, he responded to, their traumas are not comparable. That does not change the fact that they could be used to similar reactionary political ends by capital. But the point that I think we're trying to make, and that Danny's making, is that like capital doesn't need that, right? It doesn't need excuse me, like it doesn't need that force. Like capital in this country is hegemonic, right? They get the gamut whether Biden or Trump is in office. Why do they need to utilize a fragment of the population that's like very much like unpopular, to be foot soldiers? And I think when they have the Fed, they already have the tools that they need. The American state is so much more enmeshed in a lot of ways with the capitalist class than is even comparable, I think, in the early 20th century Europe, right? It's just like they don't need to use that, right? And I think that I also agree with Danny that like capital and capitalists like prefer like liberal democracy to fascism. It's better for them. So why play the game is the point there. And just since we're throwing them up, Gabriel, appreciate the super chat very much. Gabriel, excuse me. Gabriel's that's a new pronunciation for that. Very classic name. Appreciate that though. Appreciate having Danny on, folks. We're gonna go over the post game. We got this Jimmy Dore clip, which is just so good. I really think that like save this clip, and the next time you hear one of those people coming at you or anyone else for being a shill or something like that, you can play it. It's I don't know. It's smoking gun, in my opinion.
It's a pig debasing himself. That's what it is.
There you go. And we're going to be talking about what's been going on in Minnesota, some good news, and also looking at some juicy stuff from Bernie's new book on Warren. So get access to that, patreon.com/leftreckoning. So if you're a patron, you can leave us a voicemail if you have any opinions on the subject that we were just talking about, 1-940-289-7234. Get access to that show, patreon.com/leftreckoning. Appreciate you all so much. And we'll be back. We'll be going to the post game right now. Sunday, we got Gene Bazelon on the show. We're going to be talking the Iraq War. We're also going to be dissecting one of Christopher Hitchens' most odious defenses of that brutal war. So you won't want to miss that. It's always great having Gene on the show.
Yeah, people might not know Gene was actually in Iraq in 2004, 2005. And so, yeah, it'll be very interesting to get his perspective.
It'll be really good having him. So
the first time I ever saw Gene, it was on a video interview that he conducted with Sam, and I believe I can't remember where Gene was. I think it was maybe in Turkey. I'm not sure where he was, but maybe it was Iraq again. Anyway, he but it was like they got to ask Sam a bunch of questions, but I had to edit the shit out of it because the audio got fucked up.
Oh man.
For Gene's voice then, and like at that point it was just like some guy from across the world that like we did a favor for, and then now to be friends with the guys.
It's great. Yeah. Well, to get access to that Sunday, patreon.com/leftreckoning. We're jumping over the post game right now, so see y'all in just a couple minutes. And thanks everyone. See you soon.
Peace.